Well, welcome everybody. I'm Shanta Devarajan. I'm a professor at Georgetown University and also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. And it's my pleasure to welcome the audience and the participants in the first of a very interesting seminar series that we have launched called Future Development. And the reason behind the seminar series is pretty straightforward. There's no question that there's been remarkable progress in development over the last 30, 40 years. Some people call it the greatest reduction in income poverty that civilization has ever seen. There's also been an explosion of research on development, including by the people who will be on our panel today. And yet, there's also no question that the developing world faces some really difficult challenges going forward. First of all, very serious increases in inequality in many large developing countries. Climate change is threatening some of these gains that we have achieved over the last 30, 40 years. Fragility and conflict seems to be increasing in many parts of the world. Again, keeping people in poverty for longer than they should be. And then more recently, we're facing the effects of the COVID pandemic and what that might do to development. It's the first increase in poverty we've seen in about 25, 30 years. So the purpose of the seminar was to see, can we harness that research, that incredible body of development research, to address some of these pressing challenges in the developing world over the next 10, 20 years. And what we've done is put together a series of speakers on different aspects, people who have done remarkable research in this area, but also people who are able to use that, talk about that research in terms of how it can be used to address the pressing challenges going forward. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Professor Michael Kremer. Michael is a professor at the University of Chicago and a recent Nobel Prize winner. And I think everybody knows, most people have heard of Michael's research. It's a distinguished research record. We've learned a lot from almost every one of his papers, everything from deworming school children to the O-ring theory of development. But I want to say that in addition to this distinguished research record, Michael is distinctive in that he also builds institutions. He doesn't just write his papers and publish them. He tries to build institutions that actually can make use of that research. And of course, the flagship would be the Poverty Action Lab at MIT that he and two others started. But I want to mention that there's the Development Innovation Lab at USAID that he also started, and the Advanced Market Commitment for purchase of drugs that started back in the days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but has turned out to be an important component of the development of vaccines against COVID-19. So this is really a unique economist who not only does distinguished research, but also builds institutions. And his topic will be digital agriculture. Let me just say a few words about our discussant, Maggie McMillan. Maggie is also a distinguished researcher, a professor at Tufts University, and has done some of the most important work on structural transformation, which is in many ways the core of the development challenge. And I want to add that Maggie herself has been building institutions. In particular, she is the body and brains behind the economics and public policy PhD program at Tufts, which is, I can verify that it's going very well as an institution, because I was on a panel to evaluate it just a few months ago, and we were very enthusiastic about it. Now, just a couple of things about the ground rules for the audience. We welcome your questions, but the questions need to be submitted either by email to events@cgdev.org or by Twitter to @cgdev with the hashtag CGDTalks. And also by the YouTube channel, and they're going to put that up in a minute. And then finally, we are asking the audience to mute themselves, and I think if they don't, the staff will make sure that they're muted, because otherwise you hear dogs barking in the middle of Michael's presentation or whatever. So thank you very much, and let me turn it over to Professor Michael Kremer.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I'd love to take credit for everything that you gave me. I probably shouldn't take quite so much credit for JPAL, but thanks very much. Today's work is I'd like to talk about a paper that's joined with Raisa Fabregas at Texas and Frank Schulbach at MIT. This is a paper that came out in Science earlier this year. There's a lot of excitement about digital development. So Shanta talked about some of the challenges that we're facing. There's also some potential new opportunities. And there's also a lot of concern that maybe digital development is overhyped. So, and there's beyond that sort of debate of how useful is it, there's questions of how do we structure develop institutions to address this, and what should economic policy be? So in this paper, we look at the particular case of agriculture and see if we can draw some lessons. I should say that I'll be presenting, I guess, consistent with Shanta's introduction, I'll really be, both for disclosure purposes, but also because I'll be trying to bring both perspectives to the talk. I'm partly be talking as an academic, but I should mostly be talking as an academic. But I was also involved in co-founding an NGO called Precision Development, and Precision Development works in digital agriculture. So I'll talk a little bit about my experiences from that perspective as well. Next step is advancing the slides for a talk on digital development. Let's hope I can manage to do that. For some reason, lately I've been having problems doing this. The first slide. Oh. Okay, well, why don't I think I need a new laptop. Maybe we could switch over to the other one, the backup copy. Is it possible to do that? I'm having more trouble than usual.
Give us 1 second.
Okay, why don't I'll just go ahead a little bit.
Okay, in a second.
If we can get the copy that I don't think we have the right copy. So the digital development is an area where I think there are a lot of areas of application. Obviously, mobile phones are now very widespread in the developing world, and smartphones are increasingly available as well, even in fairly low-income countries. And the main use of these phones is for the same thing that people use phones for in high-income countries: communicate with friends, with relatives, and for entertainment. But I think there's also opportunities to use this in social sectors as well. Now, the economics of that are going to be somewhat different. but I think there's promising results in a number of different areas. So one example of this is in health, and India is in the process of rolling out software to its 1 million plus community health workers. And this software is used to help the community health workers do a better job. Thanks so much. But it's also helping, and there's evidence that this leads to increased visits and to their clients, and in fact better health outcomes. In education, there are exciting results on providing information to parents on educational options, and there's evidence that that's improving educational outcomes. In social benefit administration, Banerjee et al. Have work suggesting that an electronic fund management system with dramatically reduced leakages. So I think there are many applications to government services and some exciting results. As I say, today I'd like to talk about agriculture. Maybe we can go on to the next slide. Mobile phones create the potential, at least, for low-cost, timely information provision. Costs are extremely low. These are the prices. The true social costs are likely substantially below that. In rural areas of developing countries, there's cell phone towers are present, typically, maybe not in the most remote areas, but they're underutilized. So the actual social cost of using them is very low. There's, I think, one of the exciting things about mobile phones from an agriculture point of view. There's a lot of efforts to provide face-to-face agricultural extension, and a lot of resources are spent on that, and I think that can be very important, but it's costly. There are issues of how well the incentives for agents and accountability. And in agriculture, it's very important to provide information in a timely way, and that's something that mobile phones can be particularly useful. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I'm going to start out with some evidence on what mobile phones agricultural extension can do now. But I think there are a lot of opportunities for improvement over time as we get more opportunities for integration with in-person agricultural extension, integration with supply chains. When we get technological advances like being able to use, and this will of course be easier as smartphones become more common, be able to use video to provide instructions on agricultural techniques, make it possible for farmers to take pictures of pests, for example, and send them for analysis. And as we do more and more A/B testing to explore different options for how we communicate information. So I think at some level, there's a lot of grounds for optimism. On the other hand, there's also grounds for skepticism. We see a lot of fads in development. One can ask, do farmers even need information? Maybe they already have all the information that they need. And will they change their behavior in response to mobile phone messages? There are many barriers facing farmers. There's credit problems, there's human capital issues, there's maybe shortages of labor during certain times of the year. There's questions about whether the right technologies are even available for them. So ultimately, these are empirical questions. And one of the things we wanted to do in the science article was to bring together the results from a number of different studies. So when we go into the next slide. So this shows the effects of really the most basic technology. These are basic SMS messages, text messages. So not even interactive voice recording. And these were just a very small number of messages. So this was done in a number of East African settings. There were different trials, and I'll show you first the trials with Lyme. So if you have acidic soils, which are common in the area, that can be treated with Lyme. Baseline adoption is very low. The implied benefit cost ratio, so on average across these settings, there was a 22% increase. And if you think about you take the evidence from agricultural trials, and certainly some assumptions go into that, the ratio of benefits to marginal cost for something like this would be 10 to 1. So increases that are, I don't want to exaggerate the size of these influences, the level is modest, but the implied benefit cost ratio is very high. Here's, maybe we could go to the next slide. Here's some other inputs, similar results. So why don't we go on? Okay, why don't we go to the next slide? On yields, there's also some evidence. I think this one, there's fewer studies, so things aren't as certain, but it looks like there are increases in yields as well that would yield very high benefit cost ratios. There's going beyond the impacts on individual farmers, there's some evidence of systemic effects as well. So a very nice study by Jensen, fishermen found that fishermen could use mobile phones to get their fish to the right market. That actually led to both benefits for consumers and for fishermen. Fishermen profits went up 8%, consumer prices went down 4%. Now that result, there have been a number of studies since then. Some find similar results, others don't find those results. May depend somewhat on context. Why don't we go on? I made the point earlier that some of the biggest gains may come when we can integrate this with supply chain. So here's a little bit of a clue to that. This is evidence from a sugarcane, experimental sugarcane mill in Kenya that Kasaburi et al. 2019. I was also a co-author. So the Kenyan sugar company supplies inputs on credit to farmers. The farmers then deliver their sugar to the mill, and there's a deduction for all of the inputs that were supplied for the seed, for the fertilizer, and so on. Problem is, it's pretty common for the company to deliver the fertilizer late. The farmer's taken out a loan for the fertilizer. They get the input late, or if they don't get it at all, they're not going to make as much profit. They're still going to have the deduction. I guess if they don't get it all, they don't have the deduction. They've committed their land to sugarcane rather than subsistence crops. So this is a big problem for farmers. There's a bit of a free rider problem for farmers in complaining. And at one point, there were 100,000 farmers. It's a vast area. Pretty difficult for farmers to complain. And things had to work their way up the hierarchy within the company. So it wasn't clear that there'd be any action. The company then put in a hotline where farmers could call in for free, and where there were actually outgoing calls to farmers to check in with them. And that led, and this was randomized in its initial implementation, led to a 37% reduction in failure to deliver fertilizer, and a 21% reduction in fertilizer delivery after the optimal time window. There are also spillover benefits for nearby farmers. So I think this starts to show the potential of more advanced systems that will not just be about the farmer, but will be about connecting farmers that are on the input markets and output markets, and to other parts of the system like extension workers and research, as I'll discuss later. Where do we go to the next slide? I think the long-run impacts, in some ways, these are underestimates of the impact. As I say, there were externalities in a lot of these studies, not really building that in. And I think these are early implementations. Over time, as we do more A/B tests, we're likely to improve the intervention design. And ultimately, we can take findings from one setting and use that to inform, not just copy them, but I think as we start to build up more evidence, that can inform work in other locations. When we move ahead. So I think this is an area with potential. I think it's worth, if you think just from a static point of view, it's worth investing in now because of 10 to 1 benefit cost ratios. But if you think dynamically, there's probably more we can do later on, and it's good to get to make the investments now so we can start doing some of that testing. How do we do it? Well, two obvious alternatives, markets and governments. I think both have a role. There have been a number of startups that have tried to use subscription models, telling farmers, pay us so much every month and we'll supply you messages on your phone about agriculture. Those have typically failed. It's pretty difficult to make that type of thing work. There's pretty low take-up when you charge for services. And if you think about the economics of information, we know that markets for information are subject to a lot of market failures. First, non-rivalry and non-excludability. That makes it hard to do this. Means it's not going to be efficient if you're charging, because the marginal cost is close to zero. And it may not be a great business model because it's non-excludable. We saw a lot of the information, in a lot of cases, the information went to other people who weren't paying. That makes it hard to charge the full amount that might need to recover costs. Another complication is asymmetric information. A business can come along to a farmer and say, I've got valuable information. How does the farmer know that's really valuable information? So I think this subscription type model is hard to make work. I don't want to claim we should never try it. We're not going to be in a world of first best here. I think there are other private sector models that are worth considering. I think contract farming is an exciting idea. So service providers could sell to sugar companies, to dairy cooperatives, to coffee associations. They could then provide this to all their farmers. But that's not going to work for the majority of farmers. Advertising might be another approach, although there the asymmetric information is going to come back as an issue. I think telcos may also be able to play an important role and have. So I think there's a role for markets, but I think it's probably going to be hard to go with an exclusively, certainly a subscription model, but probably an exclusively market approach. When we go to the next slide. Now, in principle, governments could help address those market failures. And I think that through precision agriculture for development or precision development, we've now been talking to a number of governments and have some experience. And I think there's a lot of interest in this. But I think a lot of the implementation also falls short. That might be because while there's capacity in agriculture ministries in agriculture, they may not have capacity in the area of consumer-facing products. They may not have, and perhaps, or in A/B testing. And I think critically, they don't have automatic feedback loops built in the way the market does, or all too often they don't. Now, I think there is, on the bright side, there's some sign that governments will respond to evidence on this. When we move on to the next slide. Let me show you an example. I think this illustrates some of the points on the last slide. The government of India, or multiple state governments, and governments in Pakistan as well, have been doing a huge amount of work to test smallholder farmers' plots and distribute soil health cards. And here you see a picture of a soil health card. As you can imagine, these are pretty difficult for farmers to understand. And a bunch of focus group work with farmers suggests that. Fishman did a nice piece showing that 70% of farmers in his sample distrusted the content. We worked with farmers, this work that Sean Cole did, to try to see how well they understood the soil health card and then try to develop an improved approach. Why don't we move to the next slide? You can see the redesigned soil health card for me, it's on the right-hand side of my screen. And this with a sort of red, green, yellow about different nutrients and specific advice based on local units of measurement, as opposed to the previous version, which wasn't necessarily based on that. Okay. When we go to the next slide. We tested comprehension. So baseline with the old soil health card was only 8%. With adding audio messages delivered over phone, that went up to 36%. Now that's not as good as you might get with video or with an agronomist, but obviously audio is much cheaper than a video or agronomist. So it looks like you can get substantial improvements with some redesign. That type of finding seems to be coming up quite frequently. We had similar experiences in Pakistan. If we go to the next slide, I'll discuss something in Ethiopia. Ethiopia had developed an IVR system, which in some ways was very nice, accessed by 3 million farmers, 600,000 new callers a year. But usage was pretty low. Repeat calls were not so high, and people were tridding. And that was in part because the system was very complex. Maybe we could go on to the next slide. This is a call that's used by data scientists, a type of chart, shows the fraction of people falling off at each stage. People had to go through, and analyzing this type of system creates, this type of interactive voice response system creates a huge data set that's readily available and that you can analyze. And we could see where people were falling off, which parts of the menu people were dropping out. And then you can think about, well, worked with the government of Ethiopia to think about how can we redesign things to make it easier. So for example, there was a long registration form that you had to fill out in the beginning, which has some advantages, but people wouldn't get through that, they would drop out. So postponing that registration led to much higher take-up. Moving from 52 to 63%, 20% increase. And there were many other areas of improvement, like instead of press 1 for pre-harvest, press 2 for planting and so on, time that so that you always press 1 for whatever season you're in. So the government conducted a bunch of A/B tests and changed the implementation of this. Why don't we move on? So I think that these types of improvements will make this, sort of may raise the benefit cost ratio from 10 to 1 to 15 to 1, 20 to 1. The big improvements are going to come, as I started to hint, if you can, for example, integrate this with in-person extension. So an extension worker can notify everybody in the area that he's coming, or can learn what the problems are, what questions farmers in the area are asking, or will just show up more because this is part of a management system. We're integrating with supply chain, so farmers can shop around for inputs, can get the best price, can get perishable products picked up and aggregate. So a truck can go out and collect tomatoes from many farmers. Also get improvements as we get technological development. So weather forecasting can be done in a much finer grained way, but if you're delivering the information by radio, you're not going to be able to use that finer grained weather forecasting. Well, with phones, you may be able to do that. I think there could also be, and this is going to be much more speculative, but I think that there could be crowdsourcing of information. So smartphones enable video and photos of crops. They also enable data sharing. So if you think about Netflix, I rate movies. That helps Netflix give better recommendations for me, but also improves the algorithm and lets Netflix give better recommendations to other people. You could imagine that if farmers could not just be, farmers could explain what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and you could have sort of a Netflix for agriculture, or you could be even more ambitious. There are ideas about citizen science. Farmers know a lot about farming. They may also know what they don't know and what they would like to know. They know what problems they're facing. You can imagine something where farmers would propose various questions that they have, ideas they have. They could work with data scientists and agriculture experiments, but also with other farmers. And not every farmer is going to want to do this, but there might be some farmers who want to try things out on their plots and do tests on their plots. Why don't we go on to the next slide? Sorry, I'll just continue on that previous topic. Sorry, if we can go back. Farmers could, together with other farmers, to do coordinated tests, learn what works, learn about the impacts of different techniques, share that information. You could have sophisticated data analysis going on as well. One of the potential problems in the way we do develop new crops, there have been It's going to be very important to develop new crops, drought-resistant crops, for example, as we have climate change. But if that's done entirely by agricultural scientists and research stations, you risk developing crops that farmers aren't going to want to use. So this could, it's not a substitute for that, but I think it could be a complement of, in addition to the agricultural research stations, next stage could be trying it out with lots of farmers who are reporting back their experiences and giving input widely. And that might allow us faster cycles of agricultural research. We don't know that yet, but I think it's a potentially exciting area. You want to go on? I do want to, when we go to the next slide now, sorry for this. I do want to, acknowledge there are definite issues with this. It's not all, I think there's a lot of area for hope, but you also have to worry that there are important regulatory issues. You could have this dominated by large seed companies that are promoting particular seeds. That you could just be getting lots of spam that and you need controls on spam. There are also important privacy issues. So there will be important regulatory issues to work out. When we go on, well, close to wrapping up. I think a few conclusions. First, I think it says the potential benefits far outweigh the costs. I think the current benefits outweigh the costs. The potential benefits far outweigh the costs. So I think this is worth investing in. This is a very low marginal cost activity, and that would say you should probably make this free. But more important, it's at some level a negative marginal cost of additional users, because more users will allow more experimentation, more opportunity for integration with other activities, other parts of agriculture. So I think there's a role for public financing. I think this is an area where we need lots of experimentation. So we need support for experimentation, but part of that experimentation, I think this experimentation, this is potentially a global public good, because it can, work done in India can inform Pakistan and Ethiopia. But it's going to be critical to not only support the experimentation, but to support the sharing of the evidence on that, to truly make it a global public good. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a very rich presentation, and also you kept to time, so appreciate both. So let's turn to Maggie for her comments.
Okay. Oops. Oops. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to, of course, be discussing Michael's work. And I just want to say, I'm not going to quibble with the idea of digital agriculture. Clearly, there's a lot of potential for reaching more smallholders and improving agricultural productivity and so on. And I guess I would love to see sort of how this could play out in other sectors as well. What I want to do in the spirit of this seminar series of future development, I want to try to put this in a bit larger context and ask some questions that I hope Michael might speak to. So, as Shanta said in his very generous introduction, I've been doing a lot of work on structural transformation, especially in Africa. So some stylized facts about labor productivity and growth in Africa. First off, it's been growing fairly rapidly. And I think now we have the data for 18 African countries, but now we have the data for 23 African countries that cover 80% of Africa's GDP. And we find that output per worker overall has been growing. Notwithstanding COVID-19, I'm not talking about that most recent phase. And also agricultural labor productivity has been growing in many countries. And the average is around 1.5% per year. And maybe some of that is a result of this digital agriculture, because as we know, cell phone penetration in African countries has been quite high. But along with these two facts, we have the third fact that labor productivity growth in the sectors where employment is expanding, like services and manufacturing, is actually falling in these sectors. And our interpretation of this stylized fact is that the income gains in agriculture have been associated with growth in the demand for non-food items produced by small and informal firms. And if you look at these graphs here, what I have here, let me take Ethiopia, because Michael mentioned Ethiopia. So what I have here is the years along the horizontal axis, and then the number of workers along the vertical axis. And this is for the manufacturing sector, because it's the one sector we can get decent disaggregated data for the different types of employment. So the top line is total employment in the manufacturing sector over time, and then the dotted line underneath is informal employment in manufacturing, and then the line down here is employment in firms with 10 or more workers. And as you can see, the vertical line is the period at which when growth in labor productivity sort of started to take off in Ethiopia. And what you can see is this huge divergence between formal manufacturing employment, informal manufacturing employment, and formal manufacturing employment. And the same situation is true in Tanzania. Whereas if you take Vietnam, and I like the case of Vietnam, because Vietnam has also experienced very significant productivity growth in agriculture. So the opposite is true in Vietnam, where you have, this is total manufacturing employment, this is formal manufacturing employment, and this is informal manufacturing employment. So we have the reverse situation in Vietnam, where the share of formal manufacturing employment is growing rapidly, and the share of informal manufacturing has stayed low or fallen. So you have these contrasting patterns. And what does this have to do with agricultural productivity growth? For Ethiopia and Tanzania, what these graphs are showing is agricultural labor productivity. So everything is normalized 1970 equals 1. So this is from 1970 to 2015 for Ethiopia and Tanzania. And you see, we all know the story of declining agricultural labor productivity in Africa. A lot of different factors responsible for this, but in the 70s and 80s, you can see declining labor productivity in agriculture. And you can also see the informal and formal manufacturing employment. And you can see that as labor productivity has started to rise in Ethiopia and in Tanzania, you can see that this corresponds almost precisely with the increasing share of informal employment in the manufacturing sector. So I guess the reason that's concerning is that these informal sector activities do not seem to generate much growth in output per worker. So this leads me to the following questions for Michael and for everybody else. So what do we expect to accomplish by raising agricultural productivity among smallholder farmers? I mean, poverty reduction, increased trade, increased processing of agricultural output, better nutrition. What is it that we want to accomplish with raising agricultural productivity, especially in the light of all the challenges posed by climate change? And my recent work on Ethiopia and Tanzania, we find very little employment growth in these processing of agricultural products, and this seems to be because these activities are highly capital intensive. So what alternative outlets are there for smallholder agricultural products? And then Vietnam, I like to compare Vietnam and Ethiopia and Tanzania because they all grow coffee and export coffee. And Vietnam has done, exceedingly well in the coffee sector. It passed performance of all African countries combined, took over, it's the second largest exporter of coffee now. It's also had enormous success in the manufacturing sector. So what did Vietnam do in the agricultural sector that's transferable, say, to the manufacturing sector? And how can the lessons from Vietnam help to inform what the possibilities are for digital agriculture? What other kinds of things need to complement digital agriculture in order for it to be as successful as some of these policies were in Vietnam? And then you touched on this already, Michael, but one of my understanding of some of the problems with raising agricultural productivity on the continent of Africa, and sorry, I'm focusing mostly on Africa because that's what I know better as opposed to India, for example, but we have different climates and different crops grown in different countries. So, teff is unique to Ethiopia. And so, but we need research, the research stations you were talking about, are they adequately funded? And are we putting enough money into like climate resistant seeds and so on? And it seems like that's very important and needs to be, as important as digital agriculture. So I'm all for expanding digital agriculture, but how can you sort of put it in the larger context, and what are the supporting activities that need to be in place to make to realize the potential of digital agriculture? Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Maggie. I think that was exactly what we were looking for, is to try to put this in the broader context of structural change, structural transformation. I don't know. We've already started receiving some questions. Actually, let me read one of the questions we got in the chat, because it's actually very similar to what one of Maggie's questions. So I'll combine the two and then turn to Michael to answer them. The question we got from the one of the media we're using, it says, digital improvements seem like large changes relative to the activity, smallholder agriculture, with a low ceiling. Shouldn't we be more concerned with moving people to higher potential activities? So that's a little bit like Maggie's first questions in her last slide. So do you want to take those, Michael?
Sure. Well, first, let me be clear. I think in the long run, people are going to have to move out of agriculture and into other sectors. No question about it. So what then are we trying to accomplish in doing things on digital agriculture? Well, I would say three things. First, it's going to be, for a long time, a lot of people are going to be in agriculture. There's large shares of the world's poor are in agriculture right now, and even in middle-income countries, you got 20%, many times 20% of the population in agriculture. So it's going to be an important sector for a while, and we should care about the welfare of those people. And if they can live better, that's great. And the second element would be, as Maggie was saying, I think we should see investment in agriculture, or success in, let me not even say investment, increased productivity in agriculture as something that will facilitate, not take away from structural change, but will facilitate that. I think that's true in a number of ways. First, international markets in agriculture are not completely free. So expansion of food production, it may be an important condition for allowing people to release labor for agriculture to move into the cities and work outside of agriculture. Second, better standards of living in agriculture can help people invest, and that could be investments in education, that can be investments in their kids' health, That could be investments in migration. That could be, standard financial investments in starting a small business. So that, and I think whether one looks at the historical examples like the British, going back to the British Industrial Revolution, which was preceded by the Agricultural Revolution, or the more recent experience of China, where freeing up agricultural reforms were a precursor to the general, much more widespread takeoff of China in manufacturing and exporting and so on. I think there's, or if one looks at more, I think either the Peter Timmer's work or much more recent work by people working at the sort of macro agricultural structural transformation view, I think there's a consensus that improving productivity in agriculture actually facilitates structural transformation. So that's the second thing that I would say in response. And then the final one is that it's a point that Doug Gollin has made. There's debates about whether we should, manufacturing is special and whether we should care about that. But to the extent that manufacturing is special, it's not manufacturing per se. It's a set of features that go with some types of manufacturing, agglomeration effects, learning by doing, external to the firm learning by doing, economies of scale. And those might characterize certain areas of manufacturing, and they may not apply to subsistence farming, but there may be other types of farming that they really do apply to, whether that's flower growing in Kenya or Ethiopia, whether that's wine in Chile, whether that's just dairy farming, or indeed, since it's come up, coffee farming, and there may be possible to move to higher value. Again, if we go back to coffee again, and this is very speculative, but when I was in India recently, I met with the head of the Coffee Board of India. They were trying to move up, create higher value coffee, and you can do that if you can brand coffee very locally. And they were trying to bring in blockchain, and I've not followed blockchain. I don't want to, no idea whether that's a good idea or not. They're trying to make sure that people could tell all the way back to the local origin of this coffee, and certainly for health and safety and regulatory reasons. Sort of tracing is something, product tracing is something that is being talked about in China and being done in China. So, so I think we can see improvements in agriculture, including in digital agriculture, as playing a role both in the short run and longer run. None of this, of course, is to say that we need policies that are favorable to manufacturing and trade, and we need investments in infrastructure. This is not and within agriculture we need many other things besides digital agriculture.
Okay, good. Now let me switch gears a little bit. There have been a couple of questions about the role of government, or whether we think government can actually respond to what you were saying, Michael. The question is, while governments may look and listen to better ways of doing things they're already doing, how responsive are they to the need for a bigger shift in priorities? And let me just add a footnote to that, because it was a question I had. Also, how would governments change some of the other activities that they're doing that actually can suppress the success of this venture? I mean, both of you mentioned Ethiopia. Ethiopia, we know, is also one of the few countries in Africa that still has a monopoly telecoms provider.
Right.
And they have steadfastly refused to liberalize for reasons we can probably understand. Now, if the government is behaving that way, and by the way, Ethiopia has some of the highest telecoms costs in the continent. So how do we get governments to change in order to adapt to the kind of things that you were talking about?
So, so I think I got involved in this initially as a researcher, and then was approached by a philanthropist who said, pitch me something. And I knew about Sean Cole's work in India, which was also finding positive effects. So, we pitched him on this idea of an NGO. This was just a few years ago. And, since then, we've we were approached by the government we were doing work with a large NGO, 1 Acre Fund, initially in Kenya. The Ethiopian government heard about it, asked us to get involved there. They had set up a system on their own. I think actually the fact that they owned the telco company, they were getting free calls from the telco company. So there was actually some advantage of that integration. I'm not saying that overall, I'm in favor of liberalization of telco markets. But anyway, we found in Ethiopia, they did this. Kenya had a problem with fall armyworm, a pest, invasive pest. They launched a program. They actually talked to the private sector telco. The private sector telco said, yes, this is a national emergency. We'll make some phone credits available for free. Rwanda's doing this. In India, seen state governments move in this direction. Pakistan, both state and national government level interest. And this is just in a few years, and most recently Brazil and Nigeria. So I would say there's a lot of interest in governments in moving in this direction. That's one of the reasons for that. One, it's cheap. Two, there are a lot of farmers out there, and politicians want to do something for farmers. There are votes there, and three, and maybe this is good, maybe this is bad. People like the idea of technology. Politicians get excited about that. So is the glass half full or half empty? Most farmers are not getting any digital agricultural information. So you could say the glass is 90% empty. If you think about how rapidly, at least during the period I've been involved in this, just in the past few years, we've gone from, we've now working with 9 or 10 governments. So that are, and then reaching millions and millions of farmers with that growing very rapidly, and costs coming down as we expand. So I'm pretty optimistic about governments. Well, I'm moderately optimistic, I guess I would say, about government involvement in this area. And I think we'll have to see whether it's sustained and expanded, and whether productivity is improved, and whether this type of integration takes place with the rest to achieve the full potential.
Okay, there's now another question on the structural transformation theme, and I'll ask Michael, but I'll also want to ask Maggie about this. The question is, changing from small to large holder farming can be complicated and counterintuitive where access to land, among other issues, remain as barriers to expanding land cultivation. How can using digital agriculture lead to structural transformation by better market integration, value chains development in cases where smallholder farming remains the predominant method of farming?
Yeah, let me mention a couple of ideas here. So there's very interesting, very new, work. So I don't even know if a full paper is out, but Lorenzo Casaburi and Jack Willis are doing work on rental markets. And basically what they tried doing was so a lot of people, as background, as to the question, there's a debate among agriculture experts. Some people argue that land is broken up into too many small holdings, and we need to realize economies of scale. We need to get larger land. Land has to be pieced together into larger land holdings, and that there are friction in land markets which prevent that. So Casaburi and Willis have a paper, and where they subsidized rental transactions, and they didn't see gains on the intensive margin, but they did see gains on the extensive margin, at least in their context. Some land that wasn't being used was being used, which suggests that perhaps there are some important frictions in these rental markets. One thing that occurs to me is that there are some types of this type of transaction could potentially be facilitated through digital means. You could imagine people wouldn't have to go. People want to rent land could advertise that digitally, and others who want want to rent in some land could shop around, and that could help make some of these connections. There's also various sort of Uber for tractors proposals out there, and there's very nice work in some sectors suggesting that you can achieve some economies of scale through sharing of equipment. So yes, maybe the tractor, for example, it's not efficient to apply that to half a hectare, but the tractor doesn't have to only be used for half a hectare. If you have the right equipment rental markets, you can use that tractor for many different farmers. And there is some interest in trying to use technology to facilitate.
Yeah, not only is there interest, but that actually exists. There's this thing called Hello Tractor in Nigeria, I think it started.
Exactly. There are multiple, yes. When I said interest, I meant commercial interest. Entrepreneurs are doing
Maggie,
this.
do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, can I say two things? First off, yeah, I think smallholders can stay small. That the economies and scale and so forth are coordination around the marketing, the logistics, trade, etc. So, and their digital interventions could be extremely helpful. I can imagine how. But I also wanted to come back to my point on agricultural productivity growth and structural transformation, because I'm not sure I made myself clear enough. We have seen agricultural productivity growth at least in African countries. We have seen structural transformation. The problem is that the jobs people are taking as they are released from agriculture are in the informal, low productivity sector. So my question is, where are the jobs going to come from that are going to drive long-run productivity growth?
Go ahead, Michael.
So look, I think there's a I think that's a critically important area. It's not one where I've been doing research recently, so I'm going to just say some things that I think are pretty standard, but that I think are probably nonetheless important lessons. There's if you can get into the labor-intensive manufacturing business, that would both can be an important source of growth, and Shanta referred to inequality earlier on. It can also lead to a much more equitable development than now. What do you need to do to get into labor-intensive manufacturing? That's a how do you do it is a much harder thing. But I think I'm actually pretty optimistic about that. One of the reasons I'm optimistic about it is because we can have competition. I'm not optimistic, be clear on the way in which I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic in that at a global level. I think there's a bunch of policy mistakes countries can make, which make it very hard to get into that. If you've got high tariffs, if you've got ports that aren't working, if you don't have your electricity is not working, if you don't allow entrepreneurs to come and work and set up shop, all of those types of things are going to make it much harder. You can try and get all those things right, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee that your country will be next, because I do think there are agglomeration effects in this. There's at least some evidence of that. But at a global level, as China gets richer, for example, it's no longer that labor-intensive manufacturing is no longer going to be done in coastal China. Well, maybe it'll move to interior China. Maybe it'll move to Vietnam. Eventually, it's going to have to move on from there, and maybe it'll move next to Bangladesh. At some point, obviously Bangladesh is doing well, but at some point it's going to be in Ghana. And I think we want to do everything we can to Ghana should try to get it there faster. But Ghana should also be investing in human capital and which I think will also help it get there faster. And maybe this is all wrong, and maybe the future is all in services or in other types of maybe Ghana is going to wind up producing call centers and high-end agriculture, and that's the future. So I think it's hard to. It's hard to have a crystal ball, but at least you can get rid of a bunch of bad policies, and you can try where there's a strong economic case, you can say, look, there's some public goods that we need to invest in or other investments that we need to make beyond just getting rid of the obviously damaging policies.
Yeah, I was hoping to hear about a future based on agriculture.
Okay.
I was hoping to hear about how, like, the future of Africa will be based on agriculture. Unlike other regions, we can't even imagine it because we haven't seen it.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you look at Chile, for example, their wine sector is doing well, and they're doing some high-end agriculture, and that's part of the economy, and same with Australia. But that's not. I'm not suggesting that that the future of the world. Most people, will. I think if we come back in 50 years, I think we're going to see a lot of structural transformation. I certainly hope so.
Okay, so now we have another interesting question. Michael, you mentioned human capital just now. So the question is, pondering the future of digital agriculture, how do you square rates of illiteracy and vast education inequalities? The second is, have there been any studies on the use of WhatsApp and Facebook to disseminate information and solicit feedback? And third is, what kind of management information systems do ministries of agriculture need to have in place to take advantage of the new tech in agriculture?
These are great questions. Some of them are things that I'm be happy to connect. If people have sort of detailed technical questions, happy to connect them to people at Precision Development who can help engage on some of them. So let me talk about the. So not everything has to be synchronous. One of the advantages of text is it doesn't have to be synchronous. You can send. So if your connection is a bit spotty, it can work. You don't need full, great connectivity to do this. But I think there's a big challenge to two-way. So farmers have to be motivated to supply that information. And they don't always necessarily do that. So finding ways to do that is going to be very important. And equally, supplying advice is much easier if you know somebody's location, because the optimal personalized advice is going to be much more valuable if you know what the weather conditions are, soil conditions, et cetera. Similarly, the information that you get from a farmer, let's say you find that people are asking about a particular pest. Well, that's very valuable information if you know where the farmer is, because that could be used to advise other farmers, inform government systems, et cetera, of a pest outbreak. But so that basic location information is often missing. So trying to get, one possibility would be to try to crowdsource location information, particularly as you get into a situation where some people have some people have smartphones with GPS loaded on them. Then potentially you could get in a world where they would provide that information, location information, to others, and that could be crowdsourced. And I think that would enable much more two-way flow of information.
Okay. Well, I think we're reaching the end point here. So let me first thank both Michael Kremer and Maggie McMillan for very interesting presentations and discussion on this extremely important topic of digital agriculture and indeed the future of agriculture. I also want to thank both my colleagues at the Georgetown University Institute for Innovation, Development, and Evaluation, GUI2DE, or GUIDE as we affectionately call it, as well as the Center for Global Development, for hosting this series. Stay tuned. Our next speaker will be Pascaline Dupas, talking of Stanford University, talking about health, with Jishnu Das of Georgetown University as the discussant. So thank you all very much. I want to thank the organizers and the participants as well for sending in questions and making everything move go smoothly, or at least as far as I could tell, they went smoothly. Maybe there were some glitches that we don't know about. And hope you all have a good afternoon or evening, as the case may be.